Christmas night, the ranch shimmered with lights and laughter, but when my father raised his glass, the room fell silent. "Rachel," he said, voice calm like a guillotine, "you're no longer part of this family's legacy." "I'm Rachel Monroe, 35, a decorated army colonel. I've led troops through hell, survived ambushes, and buried friends in the sand. But nothing cut deeper than being disowned in front of a table full of blood. They thought I'd stay quiet, that I'd leave, forgotten. What they didn't know was I came home for a reason. And the war they started? It wasn't over yet. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light against the stone hearth as laughter danced around the long oak table. Glasses of wine clinked. The scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon-spiced cider, and pine needles wrapped the air like a holiday card brought to life. Outside, snow blanketed the Montana hills in silence, but inside the Monroe family ranch, it was warm and bustling, perfect on the surface. I sat at the far end of the table, the same spot I used to be told to occupy, so the adults can talk. 8 years had passed since I last stepped foot into this house, and yet no one acted like I'd been missing. They smiled politely when I walked in earlier, offered brief hugs, even called me by name. But I knew the look. That glance, reserved for the black sheep who dares to return. I wasn't Rachel the soldier, not here. I was Rachel the awkward relative, the long-lost daughter no one missed. I wore a simple black sweater, faded jeans, and boots scuffed by years in places my family couldn't pronounce. No uniform, no medals, no sign of rank. I didn't want the attention it might bring. I wanted to see if they could see me without it. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. Bradley, my older brother, by 3 years, held court at the centre of the table like a king on his throne. His designer blazer looked too tight around the shoulders. He'd bulked up, probably from golf or bourbon. He was talking about the Monroe Cattle Company's expansion into tech-enabled supply chains, whatever that meant. Everyone around him leaned in, nodding as if his words were gospel. "Our deal with Calgary just closed," he said, with that smug half smile. 6 figures saved just in Q4. Dad's vision is finally turning global. "Bravo, Brad," one uncle cheered, lifting his glass. Others followed. My father, Douglas Monroe, sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable, but clearly satisfied. He nodded once, sipped from a crystal tumbler, and looked around the table like a general surveying his victorious battalion. When his eyes briefly met mine, they didn't linger. I glanced around. My mother, Imogen, busied herself folding napkins, even though they were already folded. She hadn't made eye contact since I arrived. My cousins giggled over holiday selfies. No one asked about where I'd been or what I'd done. I may as well have been a waiter delivering wine. I reached for a dinner roll, something to occupy my hands. My fingers brushed the edge of a butter dish just as the conversation shifted again. "You're really stepping into Dad's shoes, huh?" said Uncle Ray to Bradley. Bradley chuckled. "Well, someone has to carry the legacy." Legacy. That word sat in my chest like a stone. I forced a smile and broke the roll in half, steam curling into the air. The warmth didn't reach my fingers. In that moment, my mind drifted 8 years back. I had stood right where I did earlier that day, suitcase in hand, boots muddy from the road, heart pounding with the decision I'd made. I was 27 then, fresh out of my 3rd deployment, with a chest full of medals and a soul full of silence. I'd come home that summer hoping for, I don't even know what, recognition, redemption. Instead, I got a lukewarm hello and a reminder not to talk about war stuff at dinner. That night, I left before dessert. No one followed. So why did I come back now? Maybe to prove to myself I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Maybe because some wounds only close when you stop running from where they started. My niece, Chloe, Bradley's daughter, 13 and sharp-eyed, looked at me from across the table. Her eyes held something the others didn't. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. She opened her mouth to say something, but her mother quickly redirected her with a whisper. Chloe glanced back at me, disappointed. I smiled gently. She smiled back. At least one person still saw me. The sound of silverware faded slowly as Douglas Munro stood up. His movements were deliberate, commanding attention with the same authority he once used to silence a room full of ranch hands. Now he didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his name did the talking. He cleared his throat just once, and the room went still. Forks hovered mid-air, glasses paused in mid-sip. Even Chloe's restless fingers stilled on the tablecloth. "I want to make something clear tonight," he said. "Now that we're all gathered." A murmur of anticipation passed through the guests, like wind across tall grass. Some smiled expectantly. Bradley straightened his spine. I simply placed my napkin across my lap, eyes steady, face unreadable. "My son, Bradley," Douglas continued, "has proven himself beyond measure. He's expanded the business, brought innovation where others doubted, and upheld the values this family was built on." Bradley's smug grin widened. My mother blinked rapidly, hands twisting the edge of her napkin. "As of this year," Douglas said, lifting his whiskey glass slightly, "I've amended the will. The Munro estate, the ranch, the company, all assets will be passed solely to him." He paused for effect, then looked directly at me. "Rachel," he added, voice unchanging, "you are no longer included in the inheritance." Silence, not the shocked kind, the expectant kind, the kind that waits for someone to break, but I didn't. I blinked slowly, set down my wine glass, and smiled. Not the soft, wounded smile they might have expected. No, it was cold, controlled. The kind of smile I'd used when facing insurgents who thought a female commander was just for show. The kind of smile I'd learned from a lifetime of being underestimated. The silence thickened like syrup. Bradley looked sideways, as if waiting for me to argue. My mother shifted, but still didn't look up. One cousin whispered something under his breath and was promptly elbowed. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. Douglas raised an eyebrow. Maybe he expected yelling, a speech, tears. Instead, I let him sit back down in that leather chair of his, soaking in the power he thought was absolute. "Is that all?" I asked, voice light, almost polite. That made a few heads turn. "Rachel," my mother started, but her voice trailed off. I gave her a look that said, "Don't bother." For a long moment, no one spoke. The candles flickered. The fireplace crackled. Bradley cleared his throat, as if trying to reclaim the room. "Well," he said, clinking his glass, "to the future of the Munro legacy." A smattering of forced cheers followed. A few glasses clinked. I reached for my water instead, and Chloe watched every move. Her gaze wasn't pity, it was something else. Awareness, maybe, or the quiet recognition that comes from watching someone stand in a storm and not flinch. I gave her a subtle wink. She smiled, small but sure. No one else noticed. Eventually, conversation resumed, awkward and disjointed, like a party where the music never came back on. People spoke, but their voices were thinner now, less certain. Some avoided my eyes altogether. Others glanced at me with caution, as if unsure what I might do next. But I just sat there. I didn't need their sympathy. I didn't need their understanding. And I sure as hell didn't need their money. This was never about inheritance. It was about being seen. And I just reminded them that even when they tried to erase me, I didn't vanish. I took a sip of water, glanced around the table once more, and let the corner of my mouth curl upward. I'd expected nothing from this night, and I got exactly that. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation faded into the background as my thoughts drifted elsewhere. Into rooms that smelled of wood polish and worn leather, into memories stitched with silence. I was never meant to take up space in this family. Growing up in the Monroe household meant knowing your place early. And mine was never beside my father, learning about cattle futures and spreadsheets. That was for the boys, Bradley and his twin, Thomas, who died young. I was the afterthought, the quiet shadow trailing behind, too careful to be loud, too polite to protest. I remember Saturday mornings when the boys would tug on miniature suit jackets, their ties crooked but proud. My father would kneel to fix Bradley's collar, ruffle Thomas's hair, and say, "My future men." Then he'd head out with them to the company office in town, where he claimed the next generation belonged. Me? I stayed home. While they were learning assets and acreage, I was handed a flour-streaked apron. "Help your mother with the biscuits," she'd say, her voice soft but final. I'd knead dough beside her in silence, listening to the echo of my brother's laughter as the truck pulled away. She never complained, not once. Her world was built on quiet obedience. She never raised her voice, never challenged my father. If she resented her role, she buried it so deep even I couldn't find it. When I was 12, I asked her why I couldn't go with them. She just said, "Because girls don't need to know those things, darling." That night, I cried into my pillow until the sheets were damp. There was never cruelty in the way they excluded me, at least not overt, just a quiet, persistent redirection, like being gently nudged off a path you were never meant to walk. Birthdays were the same. Bradley got Lego sets of skyscrapers and business suits. I got pink dresses with frills and bows I hated. My father never asked what I liked. He assumed. He assumed I'd marry well. He assumed I'd be grateful. He assumed I would stay quiet. And for a long time I did, but not forever. It was the fall of my senior year when the guidance counsellor called me in, Mrs. Bailey. She was new to town, new to the school, and not yet jaded by the way things always were. She saw something in me no one else had bothered to notice. "You've got leadership in your blood," she said, handing me a West Point brochure. "You ever think about the military?" The moment I held that pamphlet, something inside me shifted. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I researched at the library, filled out preliminary forms during study hall, practiced running laps at dawn before the others woke up. I learned how to breathe through cramps and ignore the sting in my lungs. Then came the day I told my father. We were in the den. He was polishing one of his rifles, a family heirloom that had never fired a shot. I stood there, pamphlet in hand, rehearsed speech memorised. "I want to apply to West Point," I said, trying to sound older than 17. He didn't even look up, just kept wiping the barrel, slow and deliberate. "Women don't belong on the battlefield," he said flatly. "They break too easy." My throat tightened. It's not just about battle, it's leadership, it's discipline. "You'll marry someone who provides. That's the life you need, not chasing guns and medals." He set the rifle aside and finally looked at me, and the dismissal in his eyes was louder than any shout. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. I left the room without another word. That night, I sat under the porch light, staring into the dark, heart pounding with both rage and resolve, and for the first time I realised something chilling. It wasn't that he didn't believe in me, it was that he never saw me at all. I didn't need his blessing, not after that night. The next morning, I skipped breakfast. While my father read the paper and my mother whisked eggs in silence, I was at the post office, dropping a manila envelope into the outbound bin. My West Point application, complete with handwritten essays and photocopies of every recommendation I could scrounge up. I'd forged my own path, with no help, no cheerleaders, and no safety net. The months that followed were a blur of secrecy. I ran drills in the woods behind the ranch, carried sacks of feed on my back to build strength, memorized military structure while pretending to read romance novels. I studied until my eyes burned, rehearsed interviews in the bathroom mirror, practiced answering questions with a steady tone and an unshakable stare. I told no one, not my brothers, not my friends, and certainly not my parents. It was mine, this dream. Fragile, flickering, but finally mine. The letter came in spring, a thick envelope, not a thin one, the kind of envelope that doesn't say no. My hands trembled as I opened it, alone in the barn, dust swirling in the sunlight. "Congratulations," it began. The rest blurred through the tears in my eyes. I had done it, all by myself. That evening I set the letter down in front of my father during dinner, not with hope, not with pride, just finality. He barely looked at it. "I said no," he muttered, folding his napkin. "I wasn't asking," I said quietly. He stood up and walked away. So I packed. It took 2 days to gather what little I owned. Jeans, t-shirts, a pair of boots I'd saved up for, my old duffel bag with one broken zipper and the initials RM stitched on the side. I didn't leave a note. They wouldn't have read it. That final night I stood on the porch beneath the same light that had guided me since childhood. It flickered faintly against the dark, wind tugging at the hem of my coat. Inside, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no one calling my name. I waited 5 more minutes, nothing. So I walked. Gravel crunched under my boots, the weight of the bag pulling on my shoulder like a ghost. The night air bit at my cheeks, but I didn't stop, not even when I reached the end of the long driveway and turned for one last look. No silhouette stood in the doorway, no figure on the porch, just silence and the knowledge that I wasn't missed. The bus stop was 10 miles away. I walked half of it before a trucker offered a ride. I thanked him, climbed in, and sat in the passenger seat with my bag between us like a shield. He didn't ask questions, just turned on the radio and drove. When we reached the Greyhound station, I thanked him again and handed him a candy bar I'd kept in my coat pocket. The bus rolled in just past midnight. Cold metal steps, smell of diesel and wet coats. I found a seat near the back, by the window, and rested my forehead against the glass. As the engine rumbled to life and the bus pulled away from the only home I'd ever known, I whispered to my reflection, "If I want to be seen, I'll have to become impossible to ignore." That was the vow, not shouted, not carved into stone, just a quiet promise in the dark. But it stayed with me, through every bruise, every climb, every sleepless night that would follow. It wasn't ambition, it was survival, and it was the beginning of everything. West Point wasn't built to welcome, it was built to test, to strip, to harden. And for a 17-year-old girl from a cattle ranch in Montana, it felt more like exile than opportunity. The first day, I was issued boots that didn't fit, a bunk that smelled like dust and bleach, and a schedule So brutal, it made my high school routine feel like summer camp. The walls were sterile, the upperclassmen's eyes were sharp, and the unspoken message was clear. I didn't belong. They didn't say it outright, not at first. But it was in the way they looked at me, in the way they called me Monroe like a curse word, in the way they paused just long enough when reading my name from the roster to let the silence speak. Only 10 women in a class of 300. Some of the male cadets called us quota fillers behind our backs. Others didn't bother hiding it. During the first week of physical training, one of them, a second year named Hawkins, smirked as I struggled to climb the rope wall. Maybe Daddy should have taught you to knit instead. I didn't answer. I just climbed, palms burning, breath ragged, muscles screaming. I climbed. The truth was, I wanted to quit 100 times. My body wasn't built like theirs. My lungs weren't used to the altitude. My shoulders weren't used to gear packs twice my weight. But every morning I laced my boots before the sun came up. I ran when others walked. I stayed in the gym after lights out, doing push-ups in the dark, counting quietly to myself. I failed the obstacle course 3 times, passed it on the 4th. No one cheered, but someone noticed. Her name was Cindy Reyes from Brooklyn. Sharp tongue, quicker wit. She could run 5 miles like it was nothing and shoot straighter than most of the boys. We were paired for rifle drills by accident, and she stuck around by choice. "You're quiet," she said once, after a brutal training run. "Just focused," I replied. She grinned. "Focused looks like pissed off on you." We started sitting together at meals, not because we talked much, but because silence didn't feel so heavy when it was shared. She didn't ask about my past. I didn't ask about hers. We just survived the gauntlet together, one drill at a time. When I failed my first academic exam, she stayed up all night helping me retake practice versions. When she twisted her ankle during a midnight march, I carried her gear the rest of the way. And when I broke down in the barracks one night, hands shaking, chest heaving, convinced I wasn't cut out for this, she sat on the bunk beside me and said, "Rachel, you're already the toughest person I know. Don't let them rewrite your story before it's even started." I didn't cry after that night. I didn't have time. Every day at West Point was a battle, against exhaustion, against pain, against the part of me that still remembered being told I'd never belong here. But with Cindy beside me, I learned to hold the line. She made me laugh when my lungs burned. She stole extra bananas from the mess hall and left them on my bunk with dumb notes like, "Fuel for war." We weren't best friends, we were foxhole sisters. And in a place that tried to break you down to your bones, that kind of loyalty was everything. By the end of the first semester, I had calluses where blisters used to be, muscles I never knew existed, and a GPA that no longer looked like failure. And for the first time when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a ranch girl pretending to be a soldier. I saw the real thing. Winter came early that year, the wind off the Hudson bit sharper, and the mornings grew darker. By the time I reached the final quarter of my first year, I'd built armour around my mind as much as my body. But nothing had prepared me for losing Cindy. It started with rumours. Whispers in the showers, side eyes in the hallway. Notes slipped into her locker. Slurs etched into the bathroom mirror. Someone had found out about her past. About her brother in jail. About her mother working 3 jobs. Nothing she was ashamed of, but to some of the privileged cadets it was blood in the water. They circled like sharks. She tried to laugh it off at first. "Let them talk," she said, chewing on a protein bar. "Words don't bleed." But words do more than bleed. They cut deep. And when you're already exhausted, even the smallest wounds feel fatal. One afternoon I found her packing. Her bunk was half empty, her uniform folded neatly. In about What? Why? She didn't meet my eyes. I can't do this anymore. They've made it clear I'll never be one of them, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt. I wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but I knew Cindy. Once she made up her mind, she was gone. The next morning, her bed was stripped bare, and I became a ghost again. No more shared silence, no more smuggled bananas, just me and the drills and the endless march of days that didn't care who was missing. I trained harder, not because I had something to prove to them, but because Cindy had believed in me, and now it was my turn to earn that belief. I climbed to the top of my class in tactical strategy, led my unit through the harshest winter field op on record. Passed every physical trial with scores that made even the instructors blink. By the end of the second year, I was selected as squad leader. By the final year, I was company commander. I wore that title like armour, not for glory, but for survival. Because being at the top meant fewer people could hurt me. But it also meant the loneliness grew louder. Graduation day came in spring, wrapped in clear skies and polished boots. Cadets stood in rows, chins high, medals gleaming. Families cheered from the stands, flags waving, cameras flashing, names being called over loudspeakers like victories. When Rachel Monroe echoed across the stadium, I stepped forward alone. No applause, no familiar faces. Just the sound of my own boots against the pavement. I stood on the stage, received my commission, saluted the general, and walked back to my seat as the proudest, most invisible person in the entire crowd. Afterward, while my classmates embraced their parents and posed for photos, I slipped out the back gate. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to answer questions about why no one had come. I walked alone to the river, sat on a stone bench, and let the silence soak through my uniform. I'd made it. 4 years of hell. And I'd made it, but at what cost? I wasn't the girl who'd left Montana anymore. That girl had wanted to be seen, had wanted to belong. Now I just wanted to survive. The military had become more than a dream. It was my identity, my sword and shield, my proof that I was more than what they'd tried to make me. And yet, beneath the pride, there was an emptiness I couldn't name. Not grief, not regret, just the quiet echo of a life lived without witnesses. Still, I rose. Still, I moved forward. Because if no one was coming to clap for me, then I'd clap for myself. If no one was going to show up, I'd be the one who never left. And as I looked out over the water, breeze brushing against my face, I whispered the words I'd told myself on that bus years ago. I will not be ignored. Afghanistan didn't welcome us with gunfire. It welcomed us with heat, thick, dry, relentless, the kind that stuck to your bones and turned your skin to parchment. Dust clung to everything, your boots, your gear, your lungs. The sun didn't rise. It slammed into the sky like a punishment. I was 23, a newly minted lieutenant assigned to a forward operating base near Helmand province. Our outpost wasn't much, just a collection of sandbags, tents, and makeshift walls that barely held back the wind, let alone danger. Each morning started with patrol briefings and ended with radio static and the hum of helicopters somewhere in the distance. My unit didn't trust me at first. Some of the men had seen action before. Some had families back home, photos taped to the inside of their lockers. Most looked at me and saw the brass, the bars, the woman, not the soldier. They waited for me to flinch, to fail, to freeze. I didn't, because failure to me wasn't a broken plan or a lost mission. Failure was proving my father right, the man who believed I would break, so I worked. Harder than I had at West Point, harder than I thought possible. I memorized every route, learned every local village name, studied every file until I could brief backwards in my sleep. I stayed out on patrol longer than I needed to, trained twice a day, cleaned my own rifle when others sent theirs down the line. That's when I met Sergeant Ben Carter. He was in his late 40s, built like a tree trunk and just as friendly, grey at the temples, scars up both arms, and a scowl that seemed permanent. Carter didn't talk much, didn't salute unless absolutely necessary. He called me LT and nothing more. But he watched, always watched. The first time I noticed was during a night-op briefing. I'd made a call, one that turned out right, but it had gone against standard protocol. I expected backlash. I expected someone to file a report. Instead, Carter grunted, nodded once, and said, "You got spine, don't lose it." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever get from him. Over the months, something shifted. We started sharing rations during night watch. He taught me how to read sand like a story, where footprints bent, where wind exposed what humans tried to hide. He once dragged a half-burned insurgent manual from a collapsed compound and dropped it on my desk. "Homework," he said, then left without explanation. And slowly I began to talk, not much, but enough. I told him about Montana, about the ranch and the silence that raised me, about my mother's quiet eyes and my father's thunderous rules, about the letter I'd handed over and the dinner where no one spoke after. He never pitied me, just listened, sometimes grunted, sometimes handed me a thermos and said, "That's some real sad crap, LT." But he never dismissed it. That mattered. One night, during a sandstorm lockdown, we sat in the command tent, the power flickering and the wind howling like ghosts outside. I asked him why he was still out here, after so many years, after all the losses. He looked down at his boots, then said simply, "There's no peace waiting for me back home. Out here, I know what I'm worth." I didn't say anything, because I understood. We were two ghosts who had found a war that made sense. And in the blur of gunfire and quiet nights, Carter became the brother I never had. Not like Bradley, not like Thomas, who died when I was 7 and left me with a name no one spoke after. No. Ben Carter was a brother forged not by blood, but by the fire of battle, by shared silence, by the unspoken agreement that we'd never let the other fall without a fight. I still carried the loneness, still heard my father's voice every time I questioned myself. But with Carter beside me, I wasn't invisible, at least not to everyone. The mission came down at dawn. Intel had flagged a compound on the outskirts of Lashkar Gah, civilians held hostage, time-sensitive, high risk. We'd done hundreds of drills for scenarios like this. Breach, clear, extract, simple on paper, chaos in reality. The air was heavy with static as we loaded up, my team in full gear, the sun just a red slit on the horizon. I glanced at Carter, who stood by the truck, loading mags with calm precision. He caught my eye and offered a grunt. "That look on your face," he said, tightening the strap on his vest, "means someone's gonna bleed today." "Just not us," I answered, trying to match his steel. He smirked. "No promises." We hit the ground fast. Dust kicked up in every direction. Gunfire erupted before we even reached the perimeter. My headset buzzed with orders, status checks, panic spiking like electricity. I barked commands, pushed forward, focused only on the plan, until the plan went sideways. An explosion rocked the west side of the compound. Too close. Screams. A wall collapsed. 2 of our guys pinned, 1 injured. I veered off course to assess, calling for Carter through the haze. He appeared like a shadow in smoke, gun drawn, barking orders louder than the blasts. "We need to breach now," I said. "There's a child in the southeast room. Intel confirms it." Without waiting, I ran. Carter followed. The hallway inside was narrow, broken glass crunching beneath our boots. Blood smeared the walls. We moved in tandem, silent, fluid. I reached the final door, kicked it open. That's when I heard it, the shot, not aimed at me but at my back, and then the thud. I turned in time to see Carter stumble, his body jolting as another round tore through his chest. He didn't scream, he just dropped like a tree finally losing its last root. "No!" I shouted, firing instinctively. The shooter went down, but the damage was done. I dropped to my knees. "Carter! Ben! Stay with me!" He was breathing, barely. Blood pooled fast beneath him, soaking into the dust. "Don't move. I've got you. I've got you," I repeated, voice cracking. He looked up at me, blinking slowly. "Told you someone would bleed." Shut up," I snapped. "You're not dying, not today." He tried to smirk. Failed. "Take care of them," he rasped. "The team, they trust you now." Then his eyes, sharp, always watching, began to fade. I pressed harder against the wound. "Medic! Medic, now!" But I knew. He was gone before they arrived. I lifted him in my arms. This man who once mocked me for marching too stiffly, who called me LT with a smirk, who had taught me more about loyalty than any textbook ever could. I carried him out of that hellhole. Dust in my eyes, gunfire in my ears. But my steps never wavered. Later, when the dust settled and we returned to base, they asked why I didn't wait for the stretcher. Because brothers don't leave each other behind, even in death. I buried Ben Carter in a military cemetery outside Kabul, folded flag, rifle salute. His file said, Sergeant First Class Carter, exemplary service. But no file could describe who he was. He was the man who saw me when no one else did. That night I sat alone in my tent, Carter's dog tags in my hand. The silence around me felt heavier than armour. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I whispered a vow. For every mission, I'll carry your name. For every life I lead, I'll make it count. That was the moment the grief stopped being weight and became fuel. Carter's death broke something inside me, but it also forged something new, a fire, a refusal, a vow that I would never waste a second of this life he gave back to me. From that day on, I stopped trying to be accepted. I led with purpose. And the name Monroe, it no longer echoed with shame. It became a call sign for strength. Coming home didn't feel like coming back. After Afghanistan, after Carter, after everything, I didn't return to a parade or open arms. I returned to protocol, to paperwork, to airports filled with strangers who never looked me in the eye. The Army transferred me to DC, where I worked as a strategic advisor at the Pentagon. Air-conditioned halls, suits instead of uniforms. My name printed on briefing folders with gold stars embossed on the front. They called me Colonel Monroe now. People stood when I entered the room, but I still walked alone. Carter's tags hung inside my desk drawer. I touched them before every meeting, a reminder of the war that never really ends. Then came the Medal of Honor. I didn't ask for it. Didn't campaign. Just did my job, made decisions, took risks others avoided. The paperwork was submitted by my commanding officer, someone I barely knew but who'd seen the footage from the compound. They told me I was a hero. I didn't feel like one. The ceremony was stiff, controlled. Cameras flashing, officials smiling. The Secretary of Defence pinned the medal to my chest while reading a summary of valour that sounded like it belonged to someone else. Colonel Rachel Munro for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty. I nodded. I saluted. I left as soon as it ended. Requests poured in after that. Interviews, public appearances, speaking engagements. I declined them all. CNN ran a headline anyway. The quiet hero. I didn't care. Recognition had never been the goal, especially not from people who had no idea what it had cost. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon a letter arrived at my apartment. No return address. But I knew the handwriting. My mother's. Just one page, folded neatly, the creases crisp like she'd pressed it between cookbooks before sending. Rachel, I know it's been a long time. I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through. I won't pretend to have done right by you either. But Christmas is coming. Your father, he won't say it, but he would want you here. We all would. Please come home. Mum, I read it twice, then again. Part of me laughed. The idea of Douglas Munro wanting me anywhere was absurd. But the handwriting, the careful loops, the slight smudge near my name, told a different story. So I stared at the letter for hours. I thought about Montana, about the porch light that never flickered for me, about Chloe's eyes the last time I saw her, too young then to understand what being invisible meant. And somewhere between exhaustion and instinct, I packed a bag. No uniform, no ribbons, just jeans, boots, and a sweater the colour of ash. I didn't want them to see Colonel Munro. I wanted to see if they still recognised Rachel. The flight to Billings was uneventful. The rental car felt foreign beneath my hands, the roads narrower than I remembered, fewer billboards, more snow. Same sky, though, wide and indifferent. When I pulled up to the ranch, the gate creaked like always. The front porch glowed with string lights wrapped around old beams. Laughter floated through the windows, warm and familiar. For a moment I hesitated, then I stepped out. The air smelled like cedar and spice. The kind of scent that usually meant safety, but for me it only stirred ghosts. The front door opened before I knocked. Chloe stood there, taller than I remembered, her hair braided back, face caught between childhood and adolescence. She blinked, then smiled, not the kind of smile trained by politeness, but one sparked by recognition. "Aunt Rachel," she whispered, "just that. Not where have you been or why did you leave? Just my name, as if it still belonged here." "Hey, kid," I said softly. She wrapped her arms around me, the gesture awkward, unsure, like she wasn't sure how much pressure I could take. I held her back gently, surprised by the warmth of it. The only embrace that hadn't felt rehearsed since I returned. Inside, the house looked almost identical. Same leather armchairs, same fireplace mantel with the same dust-free photos. Mostly of Bradley. Wedding photos, company award plaques, smiling Christmas portraits I was never in. The decorations were Martha Stewart perfect. Table settings with holly napkin rings matching dishes. Pine cones nestled in glass bowls. Music low in the background. Bing Crosby crooning about snow. Everything looked the same. Everything except me. I didn't belong here anymore, not even as a ghost. Bradley spotted me first. "Rachel," he said with a raised brow, arms open like he'd just seen an old high school classmate. "Surprised you made it." "I was invited." "Right," he said, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, glad you could join us. Just in time for Dad's big announcement." Announcement. That word echoed too neatly in my chest. Dinner went as expected. Small talk layered over tension like frosting on a cake about to collapse. I was seated near the end of the table again, this time not even out of habit. It was just where they betrayed me. No one asked about the medal. No one asked about the war. If anything, they avoided those words entirely, like bringing up service might summon something inconvenient. They saw what they wanted, Rachel Monroe, the black sheep who left for reasons they couldn't understand and didn't care to. At one point, my mother asked if I'd like more cranberry sauce. That was the most we spoke. But between forkfuls and forced smiles, I listened. And what I heard made my stomach turn. Bradley was talking about investors, expansion opportunities, a potential restructuring of the company. Someone asked about overseas operations. Bradley leaned back, eyes gleaming. "We're exploring a sale. Not finalised, but strong interest from a few private groups out of Houston and Toronto." Aunt May blinked. "But your father said he'll come around," Bradley said. "Legacy doesn't mean clinging to the past. It means adapting." The table nodded, some reluctantly, but I heard it. The real meaning behind his words. He was selling the company. The same one Douglas Monroe built from sweat and soil. The same one he used to shame me for abandoning. The same company, he once told us, was our birthright, not a bargaining chip. And now Bradley was turning it into just that, a chip. I looked at my father, seated at the head, silent. He wasn't beaming with pride. His jaw was tight. His fingers clutched his wine glass too hard. So maybe he hadn't come around. Maybe he was just being drowned out. But I said nothing, not yet. I didn't need to scream to be heard, not anymore. The thing about truth is, it doesn't always need a spotlight. Sometimes it just needs the right silence. So I kept eating, quiet, calm, watching every face at the table. They thought I was a relic of the past. They didn't realise I'd become their reckoning. And that night, in the house that raised me but never claimed me, I waited. Because timing isn't just for war. It's for homecomings too. The wine had been poured, the turkey carved. Laughter rang louder now, emboldened by drinks and the rising heat of pride that settled around Bradley like a crown. The Monroe dining room glowed with the kind of warmth that looked good in photos, but to me it felt staged, like a dress rehearsal for a legacy that never intended to include me. Then came the moment I'd sensed all evening. Douglas Monroe stood. He didn't clink a glass, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, and the room fell silent, as if gravity itself bowed to his presence. His gaze swept the table before landing on me, just for a breath, then moved on like I was wallpaper. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, voices even and unbending as ever. "It's rare to have the whole family under one roof." Polite nods, a few smiles, forks set down. "I've been thinking long and hard about the future," he continued, "about what this family stands for and what it will leave behind. Legacy isn't about sentiment, it's about strength, vision, loyalty." Bradley sat up straighter, already basking in the light of a torch he hadn't yet been handed. "And so," Douglas said, lifting his glass slightly, "I want to formally share my decision." My mother tensed beside him, napkin twisted in her lap. She didn't look at me. "The company, the estate, all family assets will be passed on to Bradley. He has shown the initiative, the foresight, and the dedication worthy of this name." Applause broke out around the table. Not polite applause. Anticipated applause. The kind that sounded like a door slamming shut behind me. And as for Rachel, he added, the air thinned, she has chosen her own path, one that leads away from the values this family was built on, and for that reason she will not be included in the estate. No gasp, no shock, just satisfaction. Somewhere a fork clinked too loud. Bradley smiled into his wine. An uncle gave a small nod, like a prophecy had been fulfilled. I sat motionless, no flinch, no protest. Just a faint smile curling at the edge of my lips, controlled. Colder than the Montana snow outside, my eyes locked with my father's, and I held the stare long enough for him to remember I wasn't 17 anymore. The silence that followed should have belonged to him, but it belonged to me. They expected drama, a tantrum, a breakdown. Instead, I took a sip of water and raised one eyebrow, just enough to make the air in the room shift. And then, just as someone tried to change the subject, a small voice cut through the space like a scalpel. "Aunt Rachel?" It was Chloe. She was seated beside her mother, fiddling with a napkin, her voice uncertain but piercing. I turned to her. "Yes, sweetheart?" She pointed to my hand. "That ring, I've never seen it before. It's not like Mom's or Grandma's. Where did it come from?" Every eye turned. The ring, simple silver, a deep scratch on the side. It had sat on my hand through countless missions. It didn't sparkle, it didn't demand attention, but Chloe saw it. I looked down at the ring, twisting it gently. For a second, the air thickened with expectation, then unease. I could feel it. Douglas narrowing his gaze. Bradley stiffening in his seat. Even my mother paused, her breath caught in her throat. I smiled at Chloe. "It was a gift," I said softly, "from someone who saved my life." She blinked. "A soldier?" "Yes," I said. "A friend. His name was Ben." The name meant nothing to them, but the way I said it, the weight behind it, meant everything. "He gave it to me the night before he died," I continued, "told me to wear it so I'd remember not to disappear again." The room was frozen. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't shifted in my seat, but suddenly they were all listening, and for the first time in years I wasn't invisible. Before anyone could recover from the silence Chloe had created, a chair scraped back against the hardwood floor. It was Richard Hale, my father's oldest friend, a retired Navy captain who once taught me how to hold a fishing rod. He rose slowly, pulling a smartphone from his coat pocket. "Charles," he said, voice low but steady, "before you finish rewriting history tonight, I think there's something everyone ought to see." My father frowned. "Richard, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Richard said, tapping the screen. A familiar jingle rang out, the sound of a CNN live broadcast. The volume was just loud enough to slice through the tension like a blade. Faces turned toward the phone. Conversation stopped. Even Bradley stopped swirling his wine. The anchor's voice came on clear. "In today's ceremony at the Pentagon, Colonel Rachel Monroe was awarded the Medal of Honor for her actions in a high-risk rescue mission in Afghanistan." Gasps scattered like embers. The screen showed a video clip, me standing at attention, uniform crisp, sun glinting off polished medals. The Secretary of Defense pinning the medal on my chest, the citation being read aloud, my name, my rank, my story. Right there on the screen they'd all pretended didn't exist. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks as she stared at the daughter she hadn't truly seen in over a decade. Bradley's jaw clenched. His fingers froze around his glass. He looked like a man who had just bet everything on the wrong horse. And Douglas, he didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the screen like it betrayed him. But Richard wasn't finished. He tapped again. A new segment appeared. Intar and... In an unexpected turn, Colonel Monroe declined the $200,000 military bonus traditionally awarded with the medal. Instead, she donated the entire sum to the Global Orphans Relief Fund, an organisation focused on housing children displaced by war. A hush fell across the table. No one clapped. No one knew how. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, gaze even. Then came the voice that mattered most. Chloe. She leaned forward, eyes bright with something fierce and honest. I want to be like you when I grow up, she said, her voice just above a whisper. Not like Mom, not like Dad, like you. Every breath left the room at once. My sister-in-law paled. Bradley went stiff. My mother gasped softly. And Douglas? He finally looked at me. But this time not with disdain, with something closer to recognition. Not acceptance, not warmth, but awareness. As if for the first time he was seeing me not as the daughter who failed to become what he wanted, but as the woman who had become something more. The room changed. It was subtle. No one stood up. No one made speeches. But their eyes were different now, their posture. The silence around me no longer felt like isolation. It felt like reverence. I had spent so many years carving my identity far from this table, in deserts and command rooms, under fire and beneath flags. And now, without raising my voice or begging for a seat, I had forced them to see what they had refused to acknowledge, that I had never left. I had simply grown beyond their vision. And now there was no shrinking back. I turned to Chloe, reached for her hand under the table, and squeezed gently. You'll become whoever you choose, I whispered back. Just promise me you'll never let someone else choose for you. She nodded, her little chin rising with quiet pride. In that moment, I didn't need applause. I didn't need an apology. Their silence was enough. Because now it wasn't laced with dismissal, it was awe. The dining room remained hushed, even after the broadcast ended. Dishes sat half-finished, candles flickered as if unsure they were still needed. I had no intention of lingering, no need to bask in their shifting gazes. But then I saw my father stand. Douglas Monroe didn't make a show of it. He simply pushed back his chair, nodded once to no one in particular, and turned toward the hallway. Then he paused, looked over his shoulder, and beckoned me with a flick of his fingers. The room watched me rise like I was stepping onto foreign ground. He led me down a hall I hadn't walked in years. At the end was the study, a room that, when I was a child, had been more myth than space. Men only, my father used to say. Business decisions are made here. I'd peeked through its heavy doors more times than I could count, always wondering what power smelled like. Tonight, it smelled like cedar and dust and the faint burn of aged whiskey. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, just a desk lamp glowing in the corner, casting long shadows across bookshelves and mounted plaques. He stood behind the desk, gripping its edge like it held him up. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. He struggled with the next words, his voice grating. I spent most of my life building something I thought was bigger than me. This family, this name, this company. And I thought protecting it meant controlling it. I didn't speak. The silence between us stretched like wire. He looked at me then, and for the first time I didn't see the general. I saw the man. I was afraid of you, Rachel, he said, eyes glistening, not because you were weak, but because you were strong, stronger than I ever allowed myself to imagine. It landed like a crack in concrete. I swallowed the lump in my throat. You weren't supposed to be afraid of me, I said. You were supposed to stand beside me. He nodded slowly. I know that now. Tears brimmed but didn't fall. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope, worn at the edges, yellowed by time. He handed it to me. "I wrote this the day you graduated West Point," he said. "I never sent it." I stared at the envelope. My name was written on the front, in bold, deliberate strokes. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out a single page. "Rachel, today you did something no one else in this family ever has. You crossed a line I drew, not with anger but with grace. I may never understand your world, but I know it takes more courage to leave the path than to walk the one others paved for you." I didn't know how to say it that day. Maybe I still don't, but I'm proud of you, Dad. My breath caught. All these years, all the distance, and the one thing I needed most had been hidden in a drawer. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my jacket. "I don't need the company," I said softly, "or the estate, or anything with your name on it." He looked away, ashamed. "I just needed you to see me." He nodded once, his chin dipping toward his chest. "You were never invisible," he whispered. "I just refused to look." And with that, the weight between us, decades old, formed of silence and pride, began to crack. When I stepped back into the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. The same flickering candles, the same half-finished plates. But the energy, the air, it hummed with something unspoken. This time, no one looked through me. No one resumed idle chatter. The noise didn't return. It was as if every person at the table had paused mid-sentence and never found their way back. I walked to my seat at the far end, only it wasn't empty anymore. Chloe had moved. She now sat where my place card had been, hands folded neatly in her lap. When I reached her, she looked up and smiled, proud, unflinching. "I saved your seat," she said. That single line cracked something in me I didn't know was still holding. I took my place beside her. The moment I sat, her hand slipped into mine under the table. Her fingers were small but steady. Across the table, Bradley sat stiff, arms crossed. My mother dabbed at her eyes, unable to meet mine. My father had not returned yet, but his absence now felt like humility, not rejection. And then Richard spoke. He remained standing, wine glass untouched before him. "I've known this family a long time," he began, his voice roughened by years of command, but softened by emotion. "I've watched this ranch rise from dirt, this table grow from 4 chairs to 15, and I've seen what we choose to honour here, what we choose to ignore." He turned toward me. "Tonight we witnessed a reminder that legacy isn't etched in ledgers or protected by contracts. It isn't passed through bloodlines like heirlooms. Legacy is courage. It's sacrifice. It's the ability to hold your head high when the world demands you shrink." His gaze swept the room. "Rachel Monroe is your legacy." Silence. But it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. I looked around the table and saw it. Uncertainty giving way to understanding, pride folding into humility. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor. I felt like gravity, a presence none of them could ignore. Chloe leaned in. "What did Grandpa say to you?" she whispered. I smiled gently. "That he finally saw me." She grinned, eyes lighting up. "Told you." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out the folded letter. The one my father had written all those years ago but never sent. I turned it over in my hands once, then slid it toward Chloe. "Hold on to this for me," I said. "It belongs to the next woman who needs it." She blinked, stunned. "You're giving it to me?" "One day," I said, "you'll write your own letter, to a daughter or a friend or yourself. And when you do, you'll understand why it matters." She took the letter like it was made of gold, her fingers trembling slightly. I won't lose it, she whispered. I know you won't. The candlelight caught the edge of her smile, and for a moment I saw the future, not in stock reports or family businesses, but in the eyes of a girl who'd learned that worth wasn't measured in approval, but in action. Across the table, my mother finally looked at me, not with shame, not with guilt, but with something close to wonder. And Bradley, he had no words, which for once felt like victory. In that room, I didn't need to reclaim a name. I didn't need to inherit anything, because I'd already claimed the one thing no will could ever hold: the right to be seen, to be remembered not for what I took, but for what I gave. And that, I realized, was the truest inheritance of all.